Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and this is the Keto Made Simple podcast.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Eric Westman here, and welcome back to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. But from time to time, I get to interview the movers and shakers in the world that I think that you need to learn about. And today, Lily, please introduce yourself.
Hi, well, thanks for having me. My name's Lily Nichols. I'm a registered dietitian and diabetes educator. I've long been an advocate for a real food diet, and I also speak pretty extensively on macronutrient composition of the diet. So a lot of people probably in your sphere who know of my work in the gestational diabetes space or the pregnancy space. I have several books: Real Food for Pregnancy, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and Real Food for Fertility. The first of which was on gestational diabetes, and the whole reason that I felt that book needed to come into the world was that I had worked in the gestational diabetes space, both at the policy level at the state of California and also in clinical practice. I was the main diabetes educator at a very busy perinatology practice that focused on gestational diabetes. And I found that when you tried to apply the conventional advice to that condition, it often failed, mostly because the macronutrient composition is a mismatch for what the condition really is, which is insulin resistance in pregnancy. And it didn't make sense to me that we were providing such a high carb diet for these women who clearly had a carbohydrate intolerance issue. So it's like, okay, here you take a glucose tolerance test and you fail it. Well, now let's provide you with a meal plan that gives you that same amount of carbohydrate multiple times a day and expect your blood sugar to be good. It didn't make any sense.
Well, that's a lot to unpack. Let's first of all, in the gestational, so you just found out you're pregnant, right? You go in, you get a glucose tolerance test, right? And not unlike what used to be done for adults, but most doctors don't do that anymore. So you're given how much glucose is in that test these days?
Well, it depends on which version of testing you're doing. It can be anywhere from 50 to 75 to 100 grams.
So the adults, so most of my patients well, they may be thinking about their children or grandchildren. Most of my patients have reversed their medical issues as adults, and now maybe you have to be reminded about the special case of pregnancy. So, but they wouldn't, as an adult, want to drink 75 grams of glucose at once. In fact, you can check on your continuous glucose monitor and see that your blood sugar will rise like this. But of all the fields, I'm an internal medicine specialist. The OBGYNs have known for a long time, obstetrics, that if a woman has trouble handling that glucose load, they get diagnosed with gestational diabetes, and then as a routine, they've been told in the past to cut the carbs out, or at least to reduce them, right? Or go on insulin to handle the blood sugar during pregnancy. So it's kind of obvious to most of the people who watch me or have been listening to me that you eat or drink sugar, then the blood sugar goes up. So to minimize the amount of blood sugar going up, you minimize the carbs in the foods. But tell a little more about this special case of what happens with the insulin resistance when someone's pregnant.
Well, insulin resistance is going to happen in pregnancy. It's part of the natural physiology of pregnancy. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the physiological norm for blood sugar to go up over the course of pregnancy. So your pancreas will produce more insulin as the pregnancy progresses to combat that insulin resistance, but actually blood sugar tends to run a little bit lower in pregnancy if all these adaptations have, gone as expected. What's happening now is we have such a high proportion of the population with underlying insulin resistance. They come into pregnancy, they have no idea that they're pre-diabetic or borderline pre-diabetic. So they already have kind of the cards stacked against them. And then occasionally you'll have somebody who's generally pretty metabolically healthy, but their pancreas really struggles to produce larger amounts of insulin as the pregnancy progresses. But that is a much smaller proportion of the type of gestational diabetes we're seeing. That's actually been, there was a recent study that looked at different gestational diabetes subtypes, and the vast majority fell into the insulin resistant category. So they're actually producing more insulin than necessary, really. But they already had a baseline of insulin resistance, and the next category had what they called a mixed defect, where they had both insulin resistance and their pancreas is kind of struggling. And then like the last group, the very smallest proportion, they didn't have baseline insulin resistance, but their pancreas struggled with the adaptation of pregnancy. So when you have that, a so-called diagnosis of gestational diabetes, all the diagnosis is high blood sugar during pregnancy. Like there's many different ways that it can present itself.
Yeah, so the idea of insulin resistance being from high insulin levels themselves kind of holds true here, right? If someone comes in, they're already having high insulin levels, which is, I think, the root cause of insulin resistance. Basically, your body is turning down its desire to listen to the insulin. Like you're in a loud room, your ears naturally turn down the hearing so that it's not so loud. So you could fix the insulin resistance of gestational diabetes by lowering the insulin level by a low carb or low cal kind of diet. Or you could, like many adult diabetologists still do, I'm afraid, add more insulin to a place where there's already plenty of insulin, which is not going with the pathophysiology. The insulin's already too high. So, and what have you found to be effective remedies for this, or maybe just kind of guidelines for all women who are going to be pregnant, and then I guess get into what does the baby need to grow? That's really what the mom wants to eat, right?
Right. And I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with, conventionally, the way that it's often treated is by, to some degree, controlling the carbohydrate intake. But I'll speak to where the guidelines are on that, because that's the reason that I had to write all the things that I've written and why my work is so controversial. But a lot of times they're given really like more of a consistent carbohydrate diet. So we're avoiding unexpected spikes, but we have a more predictable pattern of spikes, so to speak. And if your blood sugar,
that must be better. Oh, sorry.
right. And so if your blood sugar is, higher than expected, there's only so low conventionally they want you to go in carbohydrates. So the guidelines are no less than 175 grams of carbohydrates per day.
Wow.
That's the magic number for pregnancy. Yeah. So the whole controversy with the whole pregnancy world and why so many people don't want to touch pregnancy guidelines with a 10-foot pole is like, we don't want to do anything that would harm the baby, right? So from a conventional perspective.
Although diabetes doesn't harm the baby. Wait a minute.
So I'll get into it, but so conventionally they keep carbs at no less than 175 grams a day, split through 3 meals and 3 snacks. And then if the blood sugar remains high, you treat with either insulin, sometimes metformin, sometimes glyburide, but it's like you just medicate, right? And so what I was seeing that was when you applied the conventional guidelines, they failed miserably, because you're working with somebody already with insulin resistance, and then we're providing them at least 45 grams of carbs at each meal, sometimes more if they're somebody who has higher caloric needs. And it didn't work, obviously, right? It doesn't take more than like toddler level logic to see the gaps there. The challenge, though, was proving that going lower carb is safe, right? Because there are concerns that if you put a woman on a low carb diet, then she will have higher ketone levels. And the old school thinking is that ketones harm neurodevelopment. Now, that was all based on flawed research and really a lack of research. And most of the extrapolations about ketones being harmful to fetal brain development stemmed from data on either starvation ketosis or full-blown diabetic ketoacidosis. You and I, and probably most of your listeners, know that there's a difference between those and nutritional ketosis. So it took a lot of unpacking of the literature for people to trust me when I was like, no, actually, we should titrate the carbohydrates down to a person's carb tolerance so they're not getting glucose spikes, and simply increase their calories to meet their needs through other lower carbohydrate foods. So you just increase the protein and the fat and, the non-starchy vegetables. We can still meet all the nutritional requirements, still get them a calorically adequate, protein adequate diet, and simply achieve glycemic balance, and all things are good. But that took a lot of work for people to understand that would actually be safe.
Yeah, well, even let's get to the reality in a moment. But the guideline, or what the science really says in physiology, but the guidelines still are stuck at high carb and avoid ketosis, right?
Yes.
And avoiding ketosis is really sort of a false barrier, false guardrail. I mean, it took me 20 years of teaching and learning to realize that everyone goes into ketosis if you don't eat for 2 days. Everyone.
And even overnight for most people.
Well, I was thinking of the diabetic.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're metabolically flexible, it'll be overnight. So how could something be harmful, or even just, if everyone does it when there's no food, right? So even the most staunch anti-keto people will be happy that they go into ketosis when they don't or can't get food for a few days. And it actually happened to me when I was looking at my cell phone that now, has changed. I remember using phones with cords. And in fact, my office still has one of those old things, and they still work. But, the phone was out of battery, and it said, and I was kind of looking at it. Do you want me to go into self-destruct mode? It said to me. I kind of hallucinated it. I must have been sleep deprived. No, it's not what it said. It said, do you want me to go into safe mode? So if you're developing a machine, a human, an animal, and there's no energy around, you go into safe mode. You don't go into self-destruct mode. And yet then I would go on the internet and watch doctors cluck away about how harmful ketosis was, and how, mothers, pregnant women must be eating carbs because ketosis is bad, and yet we do it. We all do it when we don't have food around. And that's because we store energy as fat. It actually makes sense. So I think there's a false barrier to be worried about having ketones in the blood, although the name probably has to be changed. There's a group now, Isabella Cooper in the UK, where they coined the term euketonemia, which means normal amount of ketones in the blood, normal ketones in the blood, not ketosis. So
I like
there's
that.
we're all taught ketosis, like halitosis, it means the abnormal condition of. So it's the first time I've seen it in the medical literature. They say euketonemia. I mean, Dr. Atkins wrote benign nutritional ketosis years
Right.
ago in his books. And we just kind of kept the nutritional ketosis term. Steve Finney would talk about nutritional ketosis, but I think it's important to change that to at least ketonemia is what I was thinking. You don't have to add the EU to the front of it. That's a little maybe too scientific, but I don't think we should be worried about having pregnant women be in ketonemia. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, the interesting part, and it's been really interesting for me to watch how we have more data on ketosis in pregnancy than we did. I wrote Real Food for Gestational Diabetes in 2015, so that's 10 years ago. There's a lot more data that's been published on it. At the time, there was no data published on what is normal maternal ketonemia in pregnancy. So we were going mostly off of studies based on urine ketones, which have really very little to no correlation, at least in pregnancy, with blood ketone levels. And so we're kind of guessing at what's normal. So we did have data going back to at least the 1970s. We knew that pregnant women were at least threefold more likely to go into ketosis overnight after an overnight fast compared to non-pregnant women. You just very readily go into ketosis, and it makes sense, right? We need to sort of dip into that like backup energy system when we don't have food coming in, because you have a baby growing that's taken from you 24/7, right? So it makes sense that we're going to be more metabolically flexible, I guess, in a way, in pregnancy, and tap into whatever fuels are necessary.
Well, I learned this through going to a meeting in Jakarta, Indonesia. This was pre-pandemic. A father basically put on the meeting because he had been for years teaching doctors in Indonesia about low carb and ketosis and how, it's okay. And the reason was his son was born with cerebral palsy. And when he went to the doctors, he's an engineer. So, most engineers are kind of, pains as patients. I mean, because they always ask questions, why? And I mean, I love it if I have time. But so Tio had a son with cerebral palsy and asked, well, what can we do? What's going on? And they said, well, there's not enough myelin in the brain. And he said, well, how do we get myelin in the brain? Well, you have to have cholesterol to make the myelin. And, well, how do you get cholesterol? And, he just kept asking. Well, it turns out children use ketones to get the cholesterol made in the brain. And so he learned about ketones, and not as a bad ketosis, but as a fuel and actually substrate for brain development for children. And it just kind of took that like a bulldog. And so I learned about women not eating carbs during pregnancy from the Indonesian doctors who said, oh yeah, well, we're a Muslim country mainly, and most of the women fast during the day, and especially during Ramadan. So it was a comfortable fit. They're not scared of not eating during the day. I mean, that just kind of defies how in my typical clinical practice, people can't imagine not eating during the day. It's like we're just conditioned to have food all around. And if it's carbs, it's turning off ketones. So basically you need ketones to help brain development. And that's probably why a pregnant woman is so flexible to get the ketones to the growing fetus. And there's the growing baby. There's a saying, and I think it's pretty much true, that babies are born in ketosis, except the first moment they get carbohydrate, if it's a breastfeeding mother who's eating carbs, even, they may be knocked out of ketosis, and they might even be given a seizure disorder. For those who have learned about the ketogenic diet for epilepsy, often it's not until they're 10 years old where a doctor says, or the parents wake up and say, well, hey, why don't we try a keto diet for my child with epilepsy? And there are like 1 out of 20 of these kids who the seizures go away overnight. So the flexibility of having ketones around gets stopped when you add carbs into the daily diet. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, long ago, and it's actually still a lot of people believe this, they will teach that the fetal brain needs glucose to grow properly. And there's this idea that ketones are going to harm them. But it's now shown 30% of fetal brain energy needs are actually met by ketones. And of course, our bodies also have the ability to create glucose. So this idea that we need to be eating all this extra glucose to meet fetal brain energy needs is a false assumption. The baby is going to grow from all different fuels, not just glucose and ketones, but lactate and other amino acids and such, right? There's all sorts of different fuels that are used. But really, it's the physiological norm as pregnancy progresses for ketogenesis in the mom to increase. So you you more readily go into ketosis in late pregnancy because the metabolism shifts from an anabolic state to a catabolic state in the latter portion of pregnancy, where you are not only sending like glucose and other fuels, but you are also tapping in literally to your fat reserves to fuel that baby's growth. And that also continues into lactation, by the way, a lot of the weight that you lose during lactation is from the breakdown of maternal fat stores that you accrued over the course of the pregnancy. And so babies really should have exposure to a state of ketosis in utero, because you're right, when they are born in a state of ketosis. They're in the deepest state of ketosis in the first few days of life before the colostrum like shifts over into mature breast milk. But breastfed babies do actually stay in ketosis even for the full first month of life, even in mothers who are consuming lots of carbohydrates. The baby
Really?
still remain in ketosis.
How do you
Yep.
how do you know that?
There's data on it. There's data published on ketone levels in babies. If they're switched to formula, which is much higher in sugar, then they are not in ketosis for quite as long. But breastfed mothers, yes, actually a significant portion of the carbs in maternal breast milk is human milk oligosaccharide. So it's fibers essentially that feed the gut microbiota of the baby. Not all of it is maternal lactose. But even in women who are in ketosis, they of course won't have the same levels of fructose or something that a woman consuming a lot of sugar will have in her milk, but you produce lactose in the mammary gland tissue itself. So there'll still be lactose in breast milk, even of a mom who's in full-blown ketosis.
Well, are you aware? So I did a rudimentary search looking for ketones in neonates, and the levels weren't so high that it was remarkable to me, but there may be variability. I didn't actually look at the specific articles themselves, but in talking to a few women at meetings, so for years I go to 2, 3, 4 meetings on keto diets a year, and there are a couple, one comes to mind who sent her breast milk to UCLA for its own, or some university in LA, and they, for a fee, will measure the content of the breast milk. And so she did that once. I said, well, do it again. The old kind of, well, do it again. Let me just see if it's replicable. And when she does keto, the amount of her breast milk goes down, but the caloric content goes up because it shifts to fat. And I was introduced to this because one medical resident years ago who was pumping for breast milk could just demonstrably see there was more fat as she froze the pumped breast milk in the milk. So we're under but even if a woman is not breastfeeding, if a woman's breastfeeding but eating tons of carbs, they're able to have ketones. No, but when they're pregnant, that really doesn't. That's a powerful push toward ketosis. If the pregnant mother is eating carbs and yet still pushing
They will probably go into ketosis overnight.
Yeah.
Even if she's eating a high carb diet, she'll probably go into ketosis overnight. And I know this because when you have women with gestational diabetes, in some clinics, they're still testing obsessively urine ketones, and they want them to test urine ketones every morning. And so they'll be spilling ketones in the morning, no matter what they do, no matter how much they carb load the night before. Of course, that's screwing up their fasting blood sugar, but nonetheless, you're still spilling ketones. And I can tell you for myself, my own 2 pregnancies, I don't necessarily eat keto. I eat what I call moderately low carb, and I have the metabolic flexibility to do so. I err on the lower carb side, but not keto. And every single time they would test my urine, ketones present. Every single time.
Of course,
Even if I like had a piece of fruit right before the visit, I would still, like, my body was just so readily in ketosis.
Sometimes I think of things in the big picture view, like, why would this happen? Teleologically, it's because the baby wants them.
Yeah.
The baby is going to send out signals to draw upon your fat and to grow, unless you really under the really extreme condition of hyperemesis gravidarum. So if a woman gets terrible nausea and can't eat for a week or 2, somehow the baby, in most cases, still survives, right? And that must be a keto process.
Yes, for sure. And
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, there has to be also some sort of like biological reasoning for it over like the course of human history and evolution, right? You go back beyond the agricultural years, we had so much more food scarcity when we're reliant upon what was hunted or gathered. You wouldn't want a pregnancy to suddenly be non-viable because you didn't have food available for a couple of days. So of course we're going to have these mechanisms, but you'll find this really interesting. There was a study done in they published it in 2024 in Dietologia, and they looked at carb intake in pregnant women versus blood ketone levels, and they actually found no correlation between carb intake and ketone levels. I'll send you the link to the paper. It was fascinating. It wasn't a huge study. It was like just over 100 women. But it was at 28 weeks of pregnancy, and they had a range of carb intake from maybe about 75 grams all the way up to upwards of like almost 400 grams, and there was no reliable correlation. So blood ketone levels were simply maintained within a fairly limited range across the spectrum of dietary habits.
Do you remember what the numbers were offhand?
Let me see if I can see I'm looking at
Great. Yeah.
range was 0.02 to 0.3 millimoles per liter.
Yeah. Well, so that's kind of low compared to the level of that's blood beta hydroxybutyrate
Correct.
levels. Yeah. So although the range of what normal ketosis is kind of keeps widening over time, the more people that are being studied. At first it was this kind of narrow range, and now if someone is measuring blood beta hydroxybutyrate, it might even be 0.3 or 0.5 being called ketosis. I don't even ask people to measure ketones because most people have ketones, but some don't. And that makes them frustrated that things aren't working because I'm not in ketosis, when no, the goal is for it to work, not to have measurable ketones. That's one of the things on the internet ketone or internet keto today gets people a little bit astray. But thank you for that reference. I would like to see that. But it would make sense that if the baby needs ketones, wants ketones, then there's going to be a mechanism for that to be there, even if the mom's eating carbs. That's
well, the placenta actually creates ketones itself too. So when there was a study out of Japan, I think there's been a couple of papers that have come out of this group, but the first one I think was 2016 off the top of my head, and they looked at ketone levels in maternal blood at delivery, cord blood, so fetal blood supply, the placenta, and the placenta by far had the highest ketone levels of all, suggesting that it's actually manufacturing ketones itself.
Well, that would kind of make sense. So, but then, when you mentioned brain energy, there's a difference between the brain growth and providing the brain energy. This is a common separation of an adult with heart disease, for example. There are many different aspects to the heart, and so here the brain needs the ketones to make cholesterol, while it could be using glucose for the energy supply. The idea of the placenta being a ketone generator, I think there was a glimpse where there were some studies going on at Duke looking at ketogenesis. It was in regard to these SGLT2 inhibitors that make the urine leak glucose. And I was talking to one of the fellows doing animal research, and he was basically saying that there are a lot of tissues that can make ketones that we just don't talk about. And the idea that kidneys make ketones is kind of an old idea. Well, no. The ketone, glucose comes from the kidneys. It's not common knowledge that the kidneys make ketones. And yet so anyway, we're just kind of learning about the whole body's use of generation and use of ketones, which is exciting. That's also to see the placenta. Don't forget about the pregnant woman and placenta and the embryo. That's really neat. So now, more to more practical things, are you teaching? Do you coach? Do you, I know you have the books and all, but I'm learning now from folks who are influencers I like the practical, hands-on, day-to-day knowledge that we've generated at Duke for years, and other people have. What are you up to these days? What can you teach me?
Yeah. Well, I teach in a couple of different avenues. I mostly focus actually on mentoring professionals these days. So I have the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, and I run a professional mentorship program for health practitioners there. I run that once a year. I do have an online course for gestational diabetes where I teach the full, protocol with a bunch of extra resources to help individuals, going through gestational diabetes at the moment. And that includes a lot on ketosis is of course covered. I also have like a handout in there for them to share with their provider if they happen to have a provider who's really freaked out about the urine ketones, to kind of assuage their fears, because that can be a big barrier. A lot of times they'll see ketones and then suggest that the client is not eating enough or not eating enough carbs, and you need to eat more carbs and go on the insulin if it's not safe for your baby's brain to do anything else, right? So I have lots of resources in there for helping with that interchange, because so much comes down to what the providers are educated on. Yeah, those would be like the main avenues. I do have individual webinars, including one on gestational diabetes for practitioners from the Women's Health and Nutrition Academy. So I do have like one-off webinars for more bite-sized content versus a full-on mentorship if people are interested. And I write lots of articles on my website, Lily Nichols RDN, for people who want to just read. There's no paywall. It's not a Substack. It's, been writing there for well over a decade now. So there's lots of resources up there too. Yeah.
Great. And you spoke at the Metabolic Health Summit, which is one of the, I think, most scientific meetings for low carb, keto, and metabolic science. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So
And I spoke there on more on fertility, on how metabolic health starts in utero. And then I got so many questions in the follow-up about low carb and pregnancy. I was like, oh, I need to come back and teach on that, because I taught on that topic at Low Carb Denver a few years prior to that. And I think that's a topic that we still need more education on, right? Like, so many people are comfortable with low carb outside of pregnancy, but when it comes to pregnancy, it gets that much more controversial. And, nobody wants to do something that could potentially harm the mom or baby. I get it. And I think there is a way to pull it off, and you can do it in a way that actually nourishes mom and baby even better than the alternative. Like, this is an interesting stat for your listeners. The number one predictor of inadequate micronutrient intake, so low vitamin and mineral intake in pregnancy, is poor carbohydrate quality, right? And we're in a state where the average American gets 58% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. So mostly, like, those are refined sugar, refined carb kind of foods. And that's a real, I think we could really push the needle, like zooming out from the forest, or zooming out from the individual trees, I should say. That's really a needle mover if we just get people eating more whole, real foods, more protein forward, not taking the fat out of everything, just having more fresh, whole foods. We're going to reduce so much of the chronic disease burden and pregnancy complications. So yeah, I'll get off my soapbox, but
no, that's great. And our first study on infertility, no, it wasn't. It was a study on PCOS. We used the low carb method. It was keto level carb restriction, and it worked really well for PCOS.
absolutely.
So even at Duke these days, sometimes I'll get someone who has gone through all the IVF. They've spent a lot of money. It's not paid for typically, and then the doctor at the end will say, maybe you should just lose some weight. And then they end up in my clinic, and I get a card from a couple every Christmas, thank you, Dr. Westman, and then the baby is growing, because often it just takes a month or two of no carbs for the infertility to go away, if it was related to
Yeah.
PCOS.
It's rather remarkable with PCOS. It's highly responsive to a higher protein, lower carb diet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the infertility area, the reason why a doctor wouldn't, an IVF specialist wouldn't immediately think of nutrition is they're mainly surgeons, right?
Right.
Or they're not nutritionally minded. I'm often trying to think of why are some doctors so resistant, and the pregnancy issue is not like most of these things. It's not just scientific; it's social. It's what typically is done, and it's perception of doing wrong,
Right.
and it kind of heightens all those things, such that even if it's healthy for a child to be and a mom to be in ketosis, but it's not generally accepted. If something bad happens to the child, the parents sue or get upset, and then the lawyers can find plenty of doctors to say that ketosis is bad for you,
Right.
and then they win the court case, even though the diet had nothing to do with it. It was years ago when they said, the top 10 things that Atkins diet causes, and that one of them was sucking chest wounds, and car accidents, and so everything will be blamed upon the darling bad boy, the bad thing,
Right.
even if the science isn't there within the court and within the practice patterns of doctors. If it's really far afield, you still may lose, even though it's the right thing to do. So that makes it more difficult in this space, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think most clinicians don't want to go against the guidelines. And I mean, I was right there in their shoes. I was being a good little dietitian and following here's the guidelines. So here's your 175-gram carb meal plan going, I don't think this is actually going to work. I eat less carbs than this and I don't have diabetes. Like, yeah.
Well, that's one, shifting, that's one reason why the SMHP, Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners, has come up with new guidelines
Yeah.
that it can support a wider range of carbs during a clinical practice. I don't think OBGYN is on the radar yet of the SMHP. That would be a, note to self
Yeah.
for another practice pattern guideline. But the idea that doctors are afraid of ketones is really just out of not knowing about it, I think.
Right.
Although I don't know if there would be enough science now to write a review paper of how it's normal and safe to be in ketosis when you have a pregnancy. I don't think there's enough data yet, or is there?
Yeah. I don't know that there's enough data to necessarily push a ketogenic style eating plan. So like I don't know where your carb recommendations are, but like 20, 30-gram carb total, no more than that per day. I don't know that the data is there for that specifically, but there have been, there was a review article in, I believe it was Diabetes Care in 2021. I can send you the link afterwards. And they looked at whether our dietary recommendations for gestational diabetes, which a lot of which are really there to be ketone avoidant. Like the whole 175-gram of carb minimum is to try to avoid ketosis. And they found that there was not enough evidence to support a higher carbohydrate intake just purely for the avoidance of ketones. Like just, it wasn't there. So,
Well,
yeah.
that reminds me of the irony of so the city of New York was trying to get rid of big gulp sodas, right? So that you lower the sugar intake, and the companies would say, well, okay, prove
Right.
that taking away big gulps will lower the obesity rate, and it's like, no, they should have had to have proved that putting soda in big gulps didn't raise the obesity.
Right.
So here, the powers that be really should have to prove that you have to have carbohydrates during the pregnancy. Of course, that's when you're in the power position of, and the perception of everything else is bad and wrong, and it's the heightened worry about medical legal issues in pregnancy I think it's fascinating. And
Yeah.
I mean, I broke my first guideline by mistake. And this is often the way you can talk about it. My friend of mine was treating someone, a doctor friend, with an A1C of 12. So the blood sugars were so out of control. The A1C was 12%. And he said, well, here, he worked upstairs down the hall, in the same area. And he said, here, take this list. This is the low carb keto list, and go see Dr. Westman down the hall, within I don't know. Well, it took 3 months for him to get to so all of the guidelines would say, this man needs to be on insulin. You look, the 12%
Absolutely.
is out of control. And oh my God, he's at risk and all that. By mistake, he went home, followed the keto diet, and his A1C was 5.5 when he came to me. And we didn't use insulin. We violated the guideline.
Well, he had so much insulin circulating in his body already.
I know.
That's true.
Well, that have you read Gary Taub's Rethinking Diabetes book?
I haven't read that one yet. No.
Well, Gary, it's a hard read for, it's a very dense, typical Gary Taub's. But in there, it basically tells the story that the insulin levels were high in type 2. It just, nobody measured it.
Right.
The measurement of insulin in the blood was only available in the 1960s. And by that time, the doctors were using insulin for those who were overweight or not type 1s. And so in that article, I've unearthed it and gone back to it. They measured insulin levels in these people with diabetes, but their weight was higher and their insulin levels were high.
Yeah.
And they said in that article, it makes no sense to give more insulin to someone whose insulin level is already high. That would be like giving more thyroid to someone whose thyroid level is already high. So, but the field of endocrinology was already so in a practice pattern of giving insulin for these folks to lower blood sugar. I think it's taken an entire, well, I'd say still most diabetologists will mindlessly, and guidelines will mindlessly just give insulin to a type 2. Now, but the pharma world is developing these medicines that lower blood sugar without insulin, right? The GLP-1s and the GLP-1 GIPs, and there'll be more shots down the road. But if you could use a medicine to lower the blood sugar and lose weight, not insulin, I mean, that there are a couple papers where there's criticism of using insulin for type 2s, and it's by those companies that are making the other drugs.
Oh, right. Of course. Yeah. When you look at those older research papers, like the 30s, 40s, 50s, you get so much more like actual data points and like free thinking in those older papers. And in so much modern literature, they're like they're trying to like wrap their mind around the cognitive dissonance needed to defend whatever is the standard of practice. They're trying to like wrap their mind around this like unexplainable thing, which is totally explainable if you just look at physiology, but like it has to fit within their framework. And it makes it a bit difficult as somebody who reads a lot of research papers, because you can get in arguments so easily with either lay readers or people who are so entrenched in the ideology, because like, well, in the discussion, they say da 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 da. I'm like, yeah, but it's incorrect. Like, this is an incorrect assessment. This is just a biased opinion piece at this point, speak to the data.
They call it a paradox.
Right? Yeah, right. Paradox. Yep.
But really it's a paradigm shift that needs to happen. Well, through, getting back to the OBGYN and carb consumption, there was a physician published papers for years, Lois Jovanovich.
We worked together at the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program. Yeah.
But never went to the keto level. There's still that fear of ketonemia, not ketosis, ketonemia or ketonuria. Although if you're a carb eater, it is the abnormal condition of having ketones. So if you're a carb eater, it's ketosis. If you're not eating carbs, it's ketonemia. But the other there was a glimmer. There was a group in Texas that contacted us to create a study of lower carb diets among pregnant women, and in fact, they were so worried about it, the perception of it being bad, they wanted to do a postpartum weight loss study first to get familiar with the
Yeah.
methods. And I thought that was a kind of a brilliant way to ease it in, because the PIs weren't ready yet to have, anyway, they have ketones in the patients.
Yeah.
So now, just getting back to the levels of carbs. If you're otherwise able to tolerate and you're carbs and you're metabolically flexible, in my latest book, there are 3 different carb levels, and I don't think everyone needs to be in ketosis.
Right.
It's definitely a therapeutic tool, and I've often said, well, I don't really know if we really should be in ketosis forever. There are early
Right.
outcomes, but I'm waiting for science. Well, the younger researchers now are looking at, well, what would happen if we were in ketosis before we have any medical issues? And so there's a very provocative paper where 10 women in their 30s chose to do keto, and they're doing it for, I think, an average of 5 years or so. And they looked at the blood, and it looked great. The markers of insulin resistance, even cancer markers that we're able to measure. They fed the UK diet of 280 grams of carbs today, and as you can imagine, everything went worse. And then they went back on a keto diet, and it looked better, kind of like before, so there was no permanent damage. It's starting to raise the question in researchers' minds, these young researchers. Many of them don't eat carbs. Actually, many of them don't even eat vegetables, which gets into that sort of carnivore space.
Right. Yeah.
What if some people are just so sensitive to vegetables, they do better without the vegetables at all? And I came back from a couple meetings in Europe this last summer, and it just kind of raised that idea that maybe we should be in ketosis as a healthier way to be. That old, maybe it is the safe mode if you're not having to run away from the woolly mammoth and you really just want to live as long as you can tranquilly. I don't know, but what is in your perspective, your signals that you've seen? Is there any harm from being in ketosis?
I don't know that I could say there's any harm. I think I really like to draw on sort of the ancestral and anthropological information we have. There was a review paper, I think it was 2011, where they looked at modern living hunter-gatherer populations and like what is their like intake of carbohydrates, and it ranged from as low as 3% of calories from carbs, so ketotic levels, all the way up to maybe about like 34% of calories from carbs, which no matter how you slice it, that's still less than where the guidelines are. The guidelines say 45 to 65%. And what was interesting is they looked at, the latitude at which these people lived. And as you get closer to the equator, a larger portion of the diet comes from carbohydrates, which makes sense because in the tropics, you have fruit growing year-round. The forests are green year-round. There's plants year-round. You go all the way up to the north of Alaska, and you got 2 hours of daylight maybe for the whole day. It depends how far north you go. But I've actually lived in Alaska before, and yeah, in the winter you can understand why these indigenous groups would not be eating virtually any carbohydrates. Like the carbs that you may be eating would be what you harvested and then saved for the winter months. So I remember reading I'm interested in foraging, so I was reading a foraging book about how they would preserve the wild growing lingonberries, which they call low bush cranberries up there, which, by the way, are extremely tart. Delicious, but extremely tart. And they would harvest them and then preserve them in seal oil, right? So even whatever like carbs you're getting, they're not sweet and they're preserved in fat, like you can see how their, macronutrient ratios would be entirely different than somebody living in the tropics with an abundance of fruit. So I likewise to you recommend, I kind of give a range in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I actually have like 3 different meal plans at different levels of carbs, mostly showing how easy it is to adjust up and down from the different levels of carbs, right? It's like very easy to overeat carbohydrates. And I'd say most people underestimate how much carbohydrate they actually consume. But the point in providing the different levels was that I think for somebody, especially who's monitoring their blood sugar, we should be aiming for euglycemia. So you should be aiming for avoiding a problematic glucose spike, of course. And some people really are like extremely carb sensitive. Maybe the people who can't tolerate any vegetables, that may be some separate things going on, and maybe genetically they do well on a more carnivore style diet. But from a blood sugar perspective, I see a wide range in carb tolerance. You have some people really eating a ketogenic diet and they're still struggling with glucose levels. And then meanwhile, you have, a young athletic girl, maybe she failed her glucose tolerance test because she doesn't eat a super high carb diet. So that amount of sugar was a bit of a shock to what her pancreas is used to releasing in terms of a bolus of insulin. But she actually does well with, maybe upwards of 35–40% of her calories coming from carbs because she's burning so much energy. So I really think it depends, but on average, I typically am recommending maybe no more than like a quarter of your calories coming from carbohydrates, a pretty sizable portion coming from protein. I think the data on protein intake is really compelling on how we need a lot more than what the dietary guidelines recommend. And I don't like when people take the fat out of all of their protein-containing foods, because when you do, you're taking out a lot of the micronutrients that you also need from them, your fat-soluble vitamins and your CoQ10 and whatnot. So I'd say
flavor for sustainability,
and flavor, right?
palatable.
But it does shock people. Like in my clinicians who do my mentorship program, we have an assignment on a meal plan and also doing a full macronutrient and micronutrient breakdown, which many people haven't done either ever, or if you're a dietitian, you haven't done that maybe since school. And people are always, part of the reason I have them do it is that it's surprising how quickly the fat adds up. So people hear like a diet that is 50% of calories from fat or 60% of calories from fat, and they go, oh my gosh, that's an insane quantity of fat. And then you look at it in terms of real food and you're like, oh, that simply means you didn't take the yolks out of your eggs. You cooked them in a tablespoon of butter. You had some nuts here. You had salmon here. You dressed your salad with some oil. You had some cheese and some avocado. Like, it's not like you're just mainlining sticks of butter, but that's the perception people have, when it comes to the macronutrient ratios.
Well, I think a lot of ways to be healthy in terms of the diet, but keeping the carbs in that range seems healthiest. The direct comparison was almost achieved in a study, a secondary analysis that Lucia Aronica did from the Stanford study called Diet Fits. And if you did ultra low fat or ultra low carb, but you weren't following them prospectively, it was a secondary analysis. There wasn't their primary hypothesis to compare these two things. That's a more accurate way to say it. The metabolic effects look very similar. If you're avoiding all of the crap, junk food, ultra processed. Still not. Dude, I'm not keen on.
None of those are PC anymore.
I'm a critic of the ultra processed because there's it's okay to have processed meats, I think. But anyway, that's
right. Because a protein powder could be ultra processed by some of their definitions. Yeah, I know. I hear you.
So the McDonald's apple pie is bad, but your mom's apple pie is fine. Wait a sec. In carb content, they're equivalent or similar, but the metabolic effects of these two extremes look really similar. So that I think there are lots of ways to be healthy. And thank you for sharing your insights today. I really appreciate that. I learned a lot.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
How do people find you or to find the latest that you're doing? I think you mentioned it once, but just again, please.
Yeah. So my main hub is my website. So lilynicholsrdn.com. There's links there for my books, for my blog, for the services and offerings that I have. There's even freebies up there. You can download, free chapter from my books. And then over on social media, I mean, I'm on all the platforms, although it seems to shift which platform I want to spend time on as time goes on. I'm mostly on Instagram these days, so Lily Nichols RDN is my handle there. You can find me on X as well, which I still call Twitter, but
Thanks again. Take care.
You.
If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our YouTube membership for early access and exclusive live Q&As with me. Just click the join button below or support us with a PayPal in the description.